This podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, an international professional body which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. To join our global community and access member-only webinars, events, a wide range of digital learning offerings, coaching and leadership resources, accreditation schemes, and more, you can find us at associationforcoaching.com. Hello, welcome to another episode in the Coaching in the Climate Crisis series. My name is George Warren and I'm your host. And today I'm joined by a philosopher, a psychotherapist, humorist, creativity trainer, and Feldenkrais practitioner. And he's also the founder of a global movement to arrive at a life-affirming culture. And his name is Andrew Gaines. Andrew, hello, how are you doing?
Hey, hello, George. Good to be online with you.
Thanks for joining me today. So, Andrew, it would be great to hear more about what you mean by a life-affirming culture.
To put it very abstractly, a life-affirming culture is simply one that cares for people and the planet. It's an umbrella term that covers the multitude of really great initiatives that are already underway. There are people working on transition towns, renewable energy, better child rearing, lots of good stuff going on. And my thought when I adapted this term, I got it from Joanna Macy, was this is a term that all these initiatives fit under, so to speak. It's also a term that stands in contrast to economic growth. And I think that's important because I think there's every reason to think that economic growth requires ever-increasing industrial production. And ever-increasing industrial production is ever-increasing environmental destruction. So a life-affirming culture stands in contrast to a growth culture, both in terms of economics and in terms of population growth.
Thanks. And so maybe you could share a bit about some of the work that you do day to day around this and around the climate crisis.
Yeah, I had the vision quite a long time back that if we were to solve the climate crisis, we need to change all the major drivers that make global warming worse. So we're looking at advertising, the big trade agreements, corporate influence on governments, a system devoted to economic growth, and we're also looking at psychological factors, retail therapy. People buy excess stuff because they're not happy, or they have to make lots of money and buy stuff to look important because they feel inadequate inside. So we're looking at a complex system. Some call it a whole system. And if we were to solve it, then somehow we need to inspire thoughtful mainstream commitment to changing the whole system. So my vision of how to do that is that those of us who care, specifically the members of the millions of groups that I just mentioned, groups who care about environmental and social well-being, that we begin to communicate with our friends, neighbors, and business colleagues. And if we can take that to scale, George, then we can catalyze the conversations and thinking that will develop the needed public will for transformative change. So what I do from day to day is talk to potential leaders about that and write about it and whatever I can with others to catalyze a global movement that we intend to become enormously influential. And I say enormously influential, but actually the bottom line is this. Greta Thunberg will have reason to hope when she sees that mainstream society is committed to turning things around. So I often quote that aphorism, and for those listening, I'd invite you to reflect on that. Is it the case that we actually need to inspire public will if we were to have the major changes needed to pull out of our ecological nosedive?
Yeah, and so it sounds like the practice you're promoting is to have conversations with those around us and start that momentum. What sort of conversations should we be having?
I developed a special tool for two tools for conversations. The first one is called Looming Disasters, and it's a set of loose leaf pages that show different aspects of things not going so well. So images of plastic and birds' guts, ugly stuff, dry riverbeds, falling water tables, prospect of a methane burp from the East Siberian ice shelf. I don't like to dwell on the doomsday stuff. And often I just take that for granted that people I talk to are aware of it, so we don't have to dwell on it. But it's the doomsday stuff that gives us a reason to change rapidly, even if it feels frightening or potentially terribly uncomfortable. If we don't change, we're going to go down the tubes, as witnessed by the recent British Columbia heat wave and fires, or the devastating fire season we had here in Australia a year ago, where there were fires all across the country, and they weren't just forest burning, they were forest vaporizing, turning into rolling clouds of gas that was burning. So climate mayhem is kicking in now, and it's going to get worse. That's the doomsday message. So I want people to get that, because when we have a conversation about slowing the economy, that's a reason to do it. We're going to lose the economy anyway on current trends. So that's the first tool, looming disasters. The one that's far more interesting, that I personally use more often, is called kitchen table conversations. It's a set of modules to talk about different aspects of the system we have and what needs to change. The primary one I call the beer coasters model. It's a set of labels on beer coasters. Purpose is to have a conversation about what are the main things that tend to make global warming worse. So that conversation starts with an invitation. Jane, you're a friend of mine. Would you be willing to take an hour with me, have coffee, and explore some of these things I'm interested in? You'd phrase it some way that makes sense to you and to Jane, but that's how it starts. And then we lay out the beer coasters one at a time, and it covers those topics I just mentioned at the very beginning. So I ask an open question. Jane, what factors can you think of that tend to make the amount of stuff go up as a proxy for it making CO2 go up? So Jane says something close to advertising, and I put that down. Then I bring in the trade agreements, because not everybody knows about them. People nod their heads with corporate control of governments. And so it goes. The really big one that I pause at is economic growth. Most of the people I happen to talk to who are kind of savvy with this stuff already, they already get that. But not everybody gets the need to slow the economy to preserve the environment. So it's really important not just to say, hey, this is important, but to slow down and say, what do you think about this? And then we have whatever reaction people have. In this, two things, George. I'm not trying to persuade anybody of anything. I lay it out, they get it or they don't. We're not having an argument. And even if somebody doesn't buy it the first time, they've seen the pattern. So it can do its magic when they think about it afterwards, as people will tend to do. Second thing is, people sometimes ask, well, Andrew, what do you want people to do after they've had the conversation? And I give a surprising answer. Nothing. I'm not after any specific action that people will do. Now, if people get our emergency, people will do things already that make sense to them. Many people already choose to travel less. Terribly, but appropriately, some women choose to not have children because they're afraid of what's coming. So I don't have to suggest practical things for people to do. And that's not my aim. My aim is to help people develop a crude but comprehensive mental map of how things work, so that they know what to change. But there's another piece to it. As individuals, we have almost no influence. And if a politician were to get up and say, folks, we're in an ecological emergency, we need to slow the economy, they would get no traction, so far as I can tell. So the idea is to have enough of these conversations that the general populace, folks like us, and also influential leaders, have a vision of why we need whole system change, so that when a high-level political leader begins to say, let's rewrite the laws and change the policies to transition to a steady state economy, they'll have prior public support. Otherwise, it won't happen. So that's the driver here.
Thanks, Andrew. And one of the things that's coming out for me is this big systems thinking that I've really enjoyed in the work, but also how part of your skill is to bring it down to quite simple or seemingly simple conversations and tools and techniques. And one of the things I took from your book was the role of play and creativity and sort of simple tools as well, even in this massive, complex, scary conversation like the climate crisis.
Yeah. Little backstory here. I trained with a genius named Moshe Feldenkrais, Many people have heard about Feldenkrais. We're known as helping people move better. So I've helped kids with cerebral palsy move better, people recovering from stroke, people with ordinary back problems. But there's more to Feldenkrais than that. Moshe had a theory about how to improve brain functioning and demonstrate that it's useful by helping people move better. But I've applied it to creativity training. So, yeah, the book I wrote about that is called Creativity Games. And in it, I have a set of games. Some are adapted from improvisational acting, but they're not just for fun. Their purpose is to help people learn to play with ideas the way great innovators do. George, let's play one. One of the important ones is called rich associations. I sometimes ask people, well, what are associations to the word cup? And people say teaspoon, sugar, tea, coffee, spoon, all relevant but close to home. A rich association goes from cup to the Melbourne Cup, famous racehorse here in Australia. Or the cup Socrates drank hemlock from, or the Holy Grail. So the exercise to learn it is you would give me a stimulus word, and I would see if I could come up with not one but two rich associations. Maybe I will, maybe I won't, but it's a game, so we can play it. You want to try? Give me a stimulus word.
Tree.
Tree. In ancient mythologies, there's a vision of the tree of life. And today oh boy, do we need to take care of trees. So that's my first one. And then speaking of trees of life, biologists have a tree of life as well, which is the maps you see into the chain of evolution from one species, other species, down to us and our cousins and all of that, and which suggests that, we are all part of the web of life. So that's two rich associations. Now, I always think about, we need to evolve a new kind of society. Education, where kids are grown up often learning to, the teachers teach to the tests, kids are supposed to get right answers, or so I've heard. It's been quite a time since I was in school. But first, these games, as you mentioned at the beginning, these games are easily teachable. The thing I just did with rich associations, I could do it back with you. We play a little bit, 6 or 7 minutes, you've got the idea. So they're very portable, and you can introduce them over coffee. Again, if many people introduce this or run workshops or introduce it into schools, we can give people the skills to get out of their silo thinking and become comfortable with thinking, quote, outside the box. So that prospect excites me about the potential of this book, Creativity Games.
And with the game Rich Associations, so it sounds like it's a word association game, but that gets more depth and gets a bit more outside the box thinking. Is that right? And is that the intention or purpose of the game?
Oh, that's right. I introduced it as word association almost, but you notice in the answer I gave with Tree of Life, I actually explored it a bit. But a rich association would be an anecdote, a personal experience. It can be a bit of scientific theory. It can be a snatch of poetry or a song. It shouldn't go on too long. You bounce back and forth. That's part of the idea of it. But you're quite right. It's not just a 1 or 2 word answer. Now, there's a bit of background to it. People have looked into where do great innovators get their ideas from. And I've observed the minds of some innovators, including Feldenkrais himself. Moshe, during our training, would at times sit on a stool and give an improvised talk for an hour or so. He would tell a bit of scientific theory, he'd crack a dirty joke, he'd talk about escaping from Paris with some scientific papers before the Germans came in World War II. I loved them. They were verbal symphonies. He wanted to make some point memorably. And after a while, I said, I'm watching the mind of a genius at work. What's he doing? And I thought, he's using rich associations. How can I teach it? So that's how this came to be.
And another of the, I guess you'd call it a technique that I really liked from reading your book was that of, I think it's called option process, something of an inquiry into the roots of our discomfort. And as a coach, I'm keen to practice bringing this technique into my coaching conversations I have. And I wondered if you could say a bit more about that and how it can help us as coaches and us as non-coaches.
Sure. The book about it is by Barry Kaufman, and it's called To Love is to Be Happy With. And it's a well-written and engaging book, but the process is quite simple. As you're coaching somebody about anything, not just climate, but you will have noticed already that there are times when people have some kind of block to doing something that from the outside would seem appropriate, maybe a little risky, but appropriate and survivable, not the end of the world. And they have some reservation. So this process starts with, let's say, I'll make up an example. You're talking to somebody and they've been on a job for some time. They think their work is well acknowledged. It's appropriate to ask for a raise, but they're a bit shy. Okay. So it goes like this. What about the prospect of asking your boss for a raise? Makes you nervous, or whatever their particular word would be. Oh, he'd get angry. And what about the prospect of your boss getting angry? Frightens you. Now it's a bit deeper. He might fire me. Bit extreme, but this is what comes up for people. And you ask each question in a very Zen way. The form of the question is the same, but each question is actually very fresh. So, and what about the prospect of being fired bothers you? That may seem like a stupid question, but it's part of the process. And the person says, well, I wouldn't have any money. And what about the prospect of not having any money? Oh, then I'd starve to death. Now we've hit something really deep and irrational. Of course, the person won't starve to death. And when you get to this irrational level, one thing that happens, and often happens, is the person realizes how irrational it is, and they just laugh and say, well, that's silly. That's not going to happen. And they let it go. So that's option process. But I find that when I apply option process, sometimes I end up talking with what some people call a subpersonality, a specific part of the person that's carrying the fear. And there are ways to talk to subpersonalities. So that's described in the book. I wrote another book called Inner Work that goes into this. But the additional technique that I think should be in every human being's toolkit, and especially in coaches, is called EFT, Emotional Freedom Techniques. And it's a method of tapping on acupressure points to resolve emotional triggers. So what's an example? Is it one that I didn't do? I gave a talk about transformative change many years ago, before my thinking was as well developed as it is now. I gave this talk to a group of sustainability engineers. So these were skilled professionals, well-trained. And at the end, I said, well, would you be willing to repeat what I just said with some other folks? And one of the guys said, well, I don't think I know enough. Now, again, he's a professional, so I thought he knew enough. And I didn't know what to do with that. Now, when I give talks to small groups like that, preface it with introducing EFT. I show them the tapping points. And by the way, the EFT, as it's called, Emotional Freedom Techniques, there's plenty of stuff on the web about it. Many people demonstrate the tapping points. They're very easy. So it's easy to pick up and learn at a rudimentary level, and that's good for getting started. So I'd introduce the tapping points. I wouldn't do a thorough training, just say, here's a possibility. Then at the end, when I say, well, would you be willing to work together with me to catalyze a movement? Then some stuff might come up. People might say, oh, kitchen table conversations, I don't want to proselytize. People think I'm weird. I don't know enough. That one comes up again, or could. And then I would say, all right, well, would you be willing to tap on that? So I says, yeah, okay, let's tap on people who think I'm weird. So we do the tapping, set up phrases. Even though I think I'm weird, I deeply and completely accept myself. On the different points, I think I'm weird. People think I'm weird. How do you feel now? If it goes well, and it's likely to go well, the person may say, oh, well, actually, some of my friends would really welcome the conversation. So you get an energetic shift that shows up as a shift in attitude and thinking. So, and that shift in attitude means you've released something that was a disempowering emotional block. Now, sometimes that's fast, and sometimes it takes a bit of digging, but the potential is there.
Thanks for sharing that, Andrew. And I guess the question I'm holding is, what other tools or techniques from your experience would you would you like to see coaches and non-coaches bringing into their conversations?
One is called the natural step. The natural step is a way of working out whether a company or a country is ecologically sustainable or not. It was developed by a Swedish cancer researcher, Karl-Henrik Robert. He wanted to teach the principles, he wanted a simple way to teach the principles of sustainability. It was picked up by a man named Ray Anderson, who was the founder and CEO of Interface Carpets. This is quite a famous story. Anderson was asked by his environmental manager to give a talk for the whole company. At the time when he gave the talk, Anderson said, well, I'll do it, but all I know is that we should obey the law. Just at that time, a book was sent to him by a good friend who he trusted. The book was by Paul Hawken, and it was called The Ecology of Commerce. And in it, Hawken, who is both a brilliant thinker and a brilliant writer, wrote about the ecological devastation done by business. And Anderson's response was to say, in his Georgia drawl, it put a spear through my heart. We can't continue to do business this way. So he invited Karl-Henrik Robert to come and train his entire staff in the natural step principles. And as a result of that, two things happened. The staff discovered all sorts of waste they'd never noticed before. So by eliminating the waste, they made a profit. The engineer said, well, we manufacture carpets. People buy them, the carpet wears out, it goes to a landfill. What if we took the carpet back and reconstituted it back into oil and then reused it to make new carpet? So they changed their business model. Instead of throwing out the carpet, selling, having it thrown out, they leased the carpet service, sold carpet tiles. And if your carpet tiles wore out, you say, hey, our carpet tiles are getting worn. Fine, we'll come replace them. They only had to place the worn ones where people walked, not the ones under the desks that never anything happened to. So they changed their business model because of training in the natural step. There are a couple of books about the natural step in business. I don't recall, but I think there's one by that title probably, by Brian Nattrass. The point being that a number of companies have picked this up. And the reason I bring it into this conversation is because the natural step provides a framework for thinking about, okay, climate change is real. How do I go about changing our business processes to reduce emissions and become responsible about not just climate change, but the whole environmental suite? Now, nobody's perfect, and no company can be perfect on their own. So one thing that I regret about Interface, first what I applaud is Anderson committed his company to becoming sustainable, and every year they give a report about the progress they've made and the progress they haven't made yet. So it looks pretty honest from the outside. But his zone of responsibility is the company gates and perhaps his supply chain. But I think that companies, like everybody, should take responsibility for the ecological well-being of our whole society. So that's the next level up beyond corporate social responsibility in terms of climate change. So I would suggest that coaches, climate coaches, look into the natural step. You might find this tool can be adapted in your conversations with senior leaders. The other tool is one I developed. I wrote a paper called Catalyzing Mass Commitment to Transformational Change. It's freely available on the Inspiring Transition website, inspiringtransition.net. And I also developed a slide deck that covers the same material. And now with Zoom, I often take people through the slide deck when I'm introducing to this idea of a transformational movement. And it's just slide deck, right? Just pictures. So one of the pictures is some images that suggest the looming disasters that I talked about. Then I show a cartoon. People like this cartoon in a perverse way. It's a brilliant cartoon. That's the like part. The perverse part, it's about how our industrial machine is devouring the earth. And people get it right away. Yeah, okay, I see that. Then I talk about, this is a really what's called a wicked problem, no simple solutions. It helps to have a goal. So I introduce the overarching goal of a life-affirming culture. And I pause then and ask people, how do you feel about that goal? And most people pick up and say, yeah, that's really good. That's helpful. And then we take people through an introduction to kitchen table conversations, the beer coasters model. And towards the end, I talk about a famous essay by Donella Meadows called leverage points, places to intervene in a system. And in that article, she said the most influential leverage point in any human system is way up at the level of the goals of the system and the paradigm of the people who set up the system. So, for example, in governance, taxes are at a lower level, but the ethos of why you want the taxes, what you're going to apply them to, that's a high level paradigm. So she's saying we have to change people's thinking basically to be most effective in catalyzing social change. After she wrote the initial essay, she added one more piece, which I really like, though I've modified it. She said, actually, there's a level beyond the paradigm, which is to be without paradigms. Oh, all right. What does she mean by being without a paradigm? Well, she actually means, because I went back and looked at it, she means trusting your intuition. We can have modes of knowledge and sensitivity that are not purely rational, but make sense when we unpack them. But I take it in a slightly different way that's complementary. When I was training with Feldenkrais, he gave us a very simple, really useful rule of thumb, piece of advice. He said, ask, what's needed now? So a client comes in, they describe the situation, I look at their body, I watch how they move, and I work out, oh, I see, they're doing this, they're doing that, so that's how come they're having this pain. I have an idea of what to change, and then I go and I do what I can to improve their coordination. But this question, what's needed now, can be applied to any situation, including what's needed now in terms of climate change. Now, I think this is critically important because I've been active in the climate movement for a long time. I'm part of the Australian Climate Action Network. My colleagues almost totally focus on renewable energy or on stopping the big coal mines, or now on stopping natural gas expansion in the Northern Territory, all of which is important. But they don't think at the level of systems change, and they don't think at the level of inspiring mass commitment to changing the system. So they are caught in a limited paradigm, I think, a limited way of thinking. I say that with some pain, because if we don't change the public paradigm, then all this protest work is just going to continue to lose. Yes, things are shifting. Most people get climate change now. Public policies are changing. There's a lot of goodwill for getting out of fossil fuels. Nevertheless, the publicly accepted system of economic growth drives a suite of environmental issues across the board that do not bode well for the well-being of coming generations. So we have to go out, grow beyond a limited paradigm and see the whole system. Hence, what's needed now? Great question. So the point of this tool, going through the slide deck on catalyzing mass commitment to transformational change, is a tool for having a thoughtful conversation with a potential leader. Many professional coaches are coaching CEOs, high-level folks. Now, as a coach, I understand the ethos is we give people support, but we don't intrude our ideas on coaches. Well, that's appropriate. It's not about imposing ideas, but maybe it's appropriate to say, Jim, we've worked together for some time. I'm curious. Let us talk about climate change. How do you feel about that? You get some response. Oh, it's all nonsense. You've got your warning. This is not a place you're going to go as a coach. If the person says, well, I'm pretty concerned about it, my kids are too, then you might say, well, would you be willing to have coffee and let's talk about the system that drives climate change? Yeah, I'll do that. So then you have an agreement to have a thoughtful conversation, and you can take them through either online, the slide deck, or online kitchen table conversations. It's all workable online now through the inspiringtransition.net website. And again, if we can take this to scale, if we can catalyze leaders doing this, then we can develop the background thinking that will lead to a healthy society, finally, a life-affirming culture.
Yeah, there's so much that resonates within me in what you're saying there. And, I'm thinking of one of my own real waking up moments, and it was quite a horrific realization. And I think you used that phrase that the climate crisis is a symptom of a wider system.
Yeah.
And that really helped me. It scared me, first of all, but it helped me sort of zoom out even further into this, I guess what you call this big picture system. And to share my own experience, I felt a bit overwhelmed when I realized that, thinking that this task is even bigger than just transitioning to, let's say, away from fossil fuels. So what would you like to say to our listeners who are thinking, I want to get involved, I want to do the right thing, I want to help, but I just feel overwhelmed and I don't know where to start?
Boy, I can appreciate that, George, and the question is spot on, indeed. The first thing is to recognize that maybe we'll fail. The sense of overwhelm, the mammoth amount of that's built into the system, give good reason to think we are unlikely to succeed. So that's the bad news. Then there's some other stuff going on. Researchers, Sherry Ray and Anderson, two researchers, developed the concept of cultural creatives. And they said there are, last I read about it, as of maybe 7 years ago, about 35% of the American population could be regarded as cultural creatives. 35%, that's a lot. And a cultural creative is, well, somebody like us, somebody who cares about the environment, not overly attached to making masses of money. Sure, we want to do okay, but not overly attached to money. Rather have a lower, less stress lifestyle and spend time with family, friends, our own projects. So there's a huge cohort of those of us who are already healthy enough to care about the environment, and maybe it's larger. So I take some encouragement from that. I think we can also take some encouragement from the fact that the really big end of town, the head of the IMF, International Monetary Fund, probably 5 years ago now, got climate change. She said, if we don't deal with climate change, we are going to be cooked, fried, and broiled. She didn't mince her words. Now, publicly, they haven't got to the idea of saying, and we need to slow the economy and take care of people to deal with climate change. But there are mysterious conversations that go on that I'm not privy to. How did she ever come to the position where she'd publicly say climate change is going to be devastating? Somehow it happened, and it's happening globally and all of that. So, and just the perverse good news again, the forest fires in British Columbia, what happened in Australia, the flooding that goes on, the increased forest fires in Siberia, if you happen to notice it, and other such realities hitting home to people. So that tipping point is happening. Hey, this stuff is real. Now, let's take it more personally. Some people, when they really get the devastation, one kind of reaction is to go into grief. And a man named Jen Bendel wrote very evocative of that, and he has a cohort of people who are concerned about what he calls deep adaptation. The really valuable part of that is just coming to grips, this stuff is real, we have to deal with it emotionally. Now, that's valid for many people. It happened not to be part of my journey. I didn't go through grief to get where I'm at. Happened to do a workshop with a brilliant teacher, Jean Houston, and she did a workshop. In it, she invited us to imagine walking backwards into the land of our ancestors. And it was a big hall in Sydney, and lights down low. I walked backwards. I was feeling bored at first. And suddenly it was as though I was a village headman 6,000 years ago, 4,000 BC, in a village in Turkey. And I was proud of my village. It was well run, it was orderly, it had a martial arts belly, life was good. And then I thought, what would it be like to be the village headman's wife? So I took a step sideways, and instantly I had a belly dancer's belly, tidal, alive. And as the wife, I loved the life of the village. And then Jean says, just at that point, all right, everybody, I'd like you to walk forward. And as you walk forward, imagine that somebody from, say, 400 years in the future is looking back to you as an ancestor, to you as an ancestor. And with that, I burst out crying, as did about half the group. And for me, it was because I felt committed to the well-being of coming generations. And at that point, I shifted from being a pessimistic idealist who knew all the troubles of the world to being a committed optimist. I know the odds, also know the good potential. So as a committed optimist, I choose to act as though I, with others, can make the difference we need. And even if we won't succeed perfectly, I actually do believe that with concerted effort, we can do a great deal that's going to flatten the curve and make things much better for coming generations. Now, people have different parts, subpersonalities I mentioned earlier, or they have feelings of despair when they look at this stuff. So you could do some inner work on that. You could tap on, even though I have this despair, I deeply and completely accept myself. Or you could, there are techniques to meet the part that carries the despair and have a conversation about it. One thing we know is that if we're in despair, we are not in our core self. Say that again. If we're in despair, we're not in our core self. I'll explain. There's a wonderful book by Bessel van der Kolk called The Body Keeps the Score, and it's about trauma and experiential techniques for healing trauma. And in it, he mentions a technique called internal family systems therapy, otherwise known as IFS, internal family systems. And the IFS folks have deep insight into how parts relate to each other internally, and they have means of healing injured parts. And they discovered that when you heal the injured parts, or even before, when you have some protective parts gently move aside, what emerges is what they call the self with a capital S, or the core self. The Buddhists call it our basic goodness or our core of goodness. So the self has qualities of care, compassion, courage, creativity. It's never injured. In the right circumstances, it can come out and, in terms of therapy, play a role in healing, but in terms of life, it should be where we're coming from in our relationships. It's a bit tricky because we have many parts. So I have a playful part. I likes to play guitar or do improvisational acting. That's not my core self, perhaps, but it's consistent with my core self. The part of me that might be despairing or judgmental, well, that's not my core self, and I should attend to those parts. And over the years, I have. When I was in my early 20s, I was so cut off from my feelings that one time when I looked at a gorgeous valley north of San Francisco, I was with some friends, and I looked out and I said, "Oh, this place is so beautiful. Even I know that it's beautiful." Well, that's pretty bleak. But I did some work with a brilliant body therapist, and then years of inner work with therapists in groups on my own, using techniques in the book, Inner Work. And I just realized about a decade ago, oh, how about this? I'm having times of uncaused joy. The thing is that if faced with the magnitude of climate and change in the system, you might consider doing some work to resolve the deep roots of your current despair, because there may be more to it than just seeing what's going on externally. Stuff could have happened when we were kids, and those same attitudes fractally show up in the way we look at the world now. Resolve the underlying stuff, and then we can be courageous in the face of climate. Yes, we may not change, but we can act courageously, and again, this is the vision. Collectively, we can make far more difference than we ever imagined. The cohort of culture creatives, the cohort of people who want to be climate coaches, we can do vastly more than we ever imagined if we align in the right direction. And again, the key thing to align in the right direction is massive numbers of conversations to help ordinary people and decision makers come to terms with the reality of our existential emergency and the systemic changes necessary to pull out of our ecological nosedive. Have courage, everybody. Let's work together and make this happen.
Inspiring words there, Andrew. Thank you. And as we bring our conversation today to a close, you mentioned your books, you mentioned the website there. What resources would you like to signpost our listeners toward if they want to follow more of your work and get involved in some of the work you're doing?
Yeah, you can get involved without ever contacting me, but if you go to send me an email, andrew.gaines@inspiringtransition.net, we can connect up. So that's for starters. All of us need to go on a learning curve. I went on a learning curve. Now I've designed tools to share that. Logical place to start would be to download, again, from the website, download Catalyzing Mass Commitment to Transformational Change, and download the slideshow. So download the slide deck, and then take a friend through a practice run. Get a feel for the tool, and then you will know people in your network, or you'll come across people on the web and reach out and say, look, use an email. Their emails, by the way, sample emails are on the website as well. I read your article. I like this about it. I think we probably have common cause. Would you be open to a conversation about how we work together to catalyze a movement to shift the culture? And if they say yes, you tee up a time and you take them through it. I'd love to hear reports of how that goes, but that's the most direct way, as I see it, in addition to the specific coaching one might be doing, to take responsibility for our future well-being in an era of climate change. There's a YouTube channel, title again, Inspiring Transition. It shows a sample conversation using the slide deck and some other material. I wrote another article introducing a new paradigm for social change. I've touched on some of the ideas in this conversation, but it's not one new paradigm, it's a number of new paradigms. But the key one is the idea of social change by helping people think better intellectually, so from silo thinking to systems thinking, and to function better emotionally, so the emotional stuff, clearing emotional triggers that we've talked about here. So all of that's available on inspiringtransition.net.
Thank you. Andrew, I read somewhere that you're a Harry Potter fan, and I wanted to ask if Dumbledore was still with us, what advice would he give us to achieve this whole system change?
Dumbledore gave the advice. He required that Snape kill him. Now, what I loved about that was if Dumbledore dies, if the wise sage, the hero, the leader dies, it's up to us.
It's up to us.
Yep. By the way, I think that, yes, I am a huge Harry Potter fan. I think that it's a work of genius. And if you look at it, not just as perhaps an interesting tale, but look at what she's really describing. She is describing beautifully a number of levels of the dynamics of power, the dynamics of evil, all the way from routine administrative evil to really wicked, malevolent evil. So she's a great philosopher as well as a great storyteller. And I don't know that she even knows that. The book was almost channeled, it looks like to me.
Thanks, Andrew. Well, that sounds like a beautiful sentiment on which to bring our conversation to a close today. Thank you so much for the conversation and for helping take these big topics and applying some really clear, simple approaches and techniques in order to have these fundamentally important conversations.
I'm glad we're working on this together, George. As I say to everybody, we have great work together to do.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks for your part in helping make that work happen. So thank you to our listeners too for staying with us, and it's been great to have you today listening. I've been George Warren, and tune in for the next episode of Coaching in the Climate Crisis. This podcast was brought to you by the Association for Coaching. Discover more business coaching resources, thought leadership, and online learning at associationforcoaching.com.